Welcome to our Monday, Thursday reflection. And we're going to engage the last night of Jesus' life. And before we get into things, I want to invite you to have a few things with you for this devotion. If you grabbed an Easter bag from the church or got one, you should have these things there. If you didn't grab one, it's okay. You might have these items around your house, and so you can just pull them together and use them with this devotion. First thing is a candle. And you can have that candle ready and a lighter to light it as a part of this devotion. And then the second piece is some unleavened bread. You had that in a Ziploc bag if you got an Easter bag. If you didn't, it's okay. If you don't have unleavened bread, don't go out and get it. Just use regular bread or use a saltine cracker. That would be fine. And for this devotion, I invite you and encourage you to connect with other people over the questions I'm going to offer to you. Find a way to interact with others and to share your thoughts and ideas with them. And so my hope is if you are with your family and you're at home to do this right before dinner or as a part of your dinner, just have it there at the dinner table and just have conversation around your meal. If you are alone at home because you're doing the physical distancing thing, then I encourage you to give someone a call. Reach out to someone and have a conversation with them about the questions I'll offer. You might even want to try something different, something new, like calling them and putting on speakerphone while you eat, and you can talk while you eat with that person almost like they're there with you, or do it over a video chat of some kind. Our family's planning to do this on Easter Sunday. We plan to reach out to our family and have a meal with them somehow, and so I hope that might be a way to connect with other people. But use this devotion to do that. And the first question that I'm going to give you to answer is, what is your favorite meal? Now, I'm not saying favorite food, I'm saying favorite meal. So it's not just one thing, but it's the whole meal there. It might be something like Christmas dinner, and then you just tell about all the different sides that you like along with that dinner. Or it could just be, I like Pizza Shack pizza and Pepsi. That's my favorite meal. Whatever it is, I invite you to share that with other people. And so you can just hit pause and let them know, this is my favorite meal. I hope that you are getting hungry for all that good food that you talked about in that time. My favorite meal is my mom's shepherd's pie. It's a whole meal in one dish, and ever since she started making it when I was young, it is just the meal that I would always love to eat. And it's kind of like a casserole. There's many layers to it. The first layer is ground beef and green beans with tomato soup mixed all together, and then the second layer is mashed potatoes, and then the third layer is cheddar cheese soup poured on top. And anytime she made that, I was in heaven because I just loved that food. And it was not too long ago, I told my mom, I need to learn how to make that. And I wondered if she could teach me and also teach my daughter Hayden, who likes to cook with me sometimes, if she could teach us how to make that shepherd's pie. And so shortly after I mentioned that to her on the phone, she sent me an email with the ingredients and the directions. And I got that and I emailed her back saying, Mom, it really wasn't about the information. I wanted you to come and cook with us. I wanted to spend some time with you and do that together. And so that was right before we were told to isolate from one another. And so it's put on hold now, but later she will come over and help us learn how to put that meal together. Meals have a way of bringing us together. And the meal that Jesus was going to have with his disciples is one of those significant meals that they would have in their lives. Every year, the people of Israel would celebrate the Passover. Passover was a time they remembered that their ancestors were slaves in Egypt, but God stepped in and set them free. And so every piece of that meal, every food that was there, everything that they had to drink, it was all part of the story that told how God stepped in and worked in the lives of their ancestors. And so they would gather every year to remember, to have that meal, and to share that story. And the meal started by lighting candles. And so I'm going to invite you to light the candle that you have. And that candle for us reminds us of the presence of Christ, the presence of Jesus. And this was a late addition to our Easter bags, and so I just threw that in there because I do think it's a great way for us to remember the presence of Christ. And the candles that we gave you all were from our Christmas Eve service. So many of you held those to remember the birth of Christ, and now we can use them to remember his life and then his death and resurrection as well. And I invite you, anytime that you're worshiping at home, when you're online, light a candle as just a reminder that Jesus is present with you in the midst of that time of worship. And so they lit a candle at the beginning. They actually lit several candles as a part of that story. And then they began to share about how the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and God chose someone, a man named Moses, to go to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and say, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh's first answer was no. He said, "I'm not letting my slave work go. I want to keep them." And his heart was hardened, is what we're told. But Moses kept on asking, and through 10 plagues that God sent on the Egyptians, eventually Pharaoh said, "Okay, get out of here. Take your people and go." And so when they said that, the Israelites had to hurry and get out of Egypt because Pharaoh was going to come after them. And so one of the things in their meal, and what I sent in the Easter bags, is unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is bread without yeast. It is bread that hasn't risen like the usual bread that we eat. And the Israelites had to have unleavened bread because they didn't have time to let the bread rise. And so they ate unleavened bread, and they took that with them so they could move quickly out of Egypt and go off to freedom. And so they came to a part in the story where Jesus was talking about that, and he took that unleavened bread. And in Matthew 26, where it tells the whole story, if you want to read it for yourself, Jesus took that bread, gave thanks to God for it, and then broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body broken for you." And so right there, Jesus is changing the story. He's moved away from the Passover story and moved into a new story of what God was doing right there in their midst. That bread was no longer representing that quickness that they had to leave, but it now represented Jesus. It represented him. And then likewise, he took a cup and he gave thanks to God for it, and he gave it to the disciples, saying, "Drink of this, all of you. This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And so Jesus was giving us this new story of God's work of freedom. He was telling us about the sacrifice that he was about to make, that through his life, his death, and his resurrection, our sins would be forgiven and we would be set free. And so many of us are familiar with this new story of communion that Jesus gives to us. It is a time that we come together to remember the grace and love of God for each and every one of us. And it's a time that we retell that story of God's love in our lives. And so what I'd like to invite you to do tonight is to take time to share the story of God's work in your life with those around you. So I'd invite you to take some of that unleavened bread or the bread that you have, and as you eat it and kind of pass it around the table for each of you to share a story of how God has worked in your life. Where have you seen God at work in your life? It might be something recent, or like their story of Passover, it might be something from years ago. You can say, "I still remember when God did this in my life, and I just thank him for that work." And so it could be recent, could be distant. It could be something you might want to try and look at. What right now, in the midst of this pandemic, what's God doing? Where is God at in the midst of this? Because I believe God is still here. God is still working around us. And so you can share those stories with one another. Or if there's not a story that's on your heart, you might share just a question you would ask God. What have you been thinking about? God, what about this or what about that? What would you ask God if you could ask him a question? And so I just invite you to go around the table, to share the unleavened bread, and to share your stories of God's work. And again, you can hit pause and share those stories. Thank you for taking the time to share the stories of God's work in your lives. The story that God's been talking to me about is just reminding me about this unleavened bread. You see, with everything that's been going on, I really wanted to hurry and to get after things. And that's what the unleavened bread represents. It represents hurry from the Israelites. They couldn't wait. They had to move quickly to get out of Egypt because the anger of Pharaoh was coming after them. And so I thought about that, and I wanted to hurry at this time and get you all communion. I wanted you to have bread and juice in your house. I wanted to put it in the Easter bags, although I wasn't sure how tasty the bread would be after a week of being in that bag. And I wanted to get to doorsteps. I wanted us to have communion together. But in the midst of that, God began to kind of flip things on me. And that's what he's been doing. Our lives have been flipped upside down. And he started to flip this on me and saying, "James, maybe you don't need to hurry so much. Maybe you need to slow down. Maybe you need to calm down in the midst of everything that's going on. Maybe when a desire or a want comes up, you don't have to just satisfy it right away and meet that need. Maybe you just need to be patient and offer some self-control." And so God was saying maybe communion is worth waiting for. Maybe offering communion is not the thing to do right now, and maybe it's something for us to set aside for this time of physical isolation, for staying away from one another and not being able to gather as a community, which if you're like me, you miss that a lot, being with other people. And it's okay to miss that. But what we can do now is we can hope, and we can look forward to that time that we'll be able to gather together. And so God was saying, maybe you hold off on communion until that time you can gather together. And when you receive communion, what a great celebration it will be, because you've waited, because you've hoped for it, you've longed for it, you've looked forward to it. And so you can celebrate it when you get back together again. And so I don't know if that's what we'll do, is we'll just wait until then. If things get too long, we'll find a way maybe to offer that, because it is a way to experience God's grace. But for now, I'd encourage you just to wait, to be patient with what God is doing around us. Don't feel like you have to hurry and get on to the next thing, but just to be calm and allow God's presence to be there with you. I hope that as you eat any meal from now on, and you eat some bread, you can remember that if that bread has risen, there's leaven in it, there's yeast in it, that there are some things worth waiting for. And we can just slow down and wait for God's timing to do the things that He wants to do in us. I pray every meal that you have, God's grace and love will be evident to you, and you can feel His presence there with you. Thank you for joining me for this devotion, this reflection. And I pray God's blessing upon you in every meal that you eat. Know that Christ is there with you.